Welcome to the Everything History Podcast for episode 44, Ammianus Marcellinus' Res Gestae, Book 14, sections 8 through 10.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Section 8, Description of the Eastern Provinces. After one passes the summits of Mount Taurus, which rises in the east to a lofty height, Cilicia spreads out in widely extended plains, a land abounding in products of every kind, and adjoining its right side is Isauria, equally blessed with fruitful vines and abundant grain, being divided in the middle by the navigable river Chalcodonus. This province, too, in addition to many towns, is adorned by two cities, Seleucia, the work of King Seleucus, and Claudiopolis, which Claudius Caesar founded as a colony. For Isauria, which was formerly too powerful, was long ago overthrown as a dangerous rebel and barely shows a few traces of its former glory. Cilicia, however, which boasts of the river Cydnus, is ennobled by the Tarsus, a fair city, that is said to have been founded by Perseus, son of Jupiter and Diana, or else by a wealthy and high-born man, Sandan by name, who came from Ethiopia. There is also Anazarbus, bearing the name of its founder, and Mopsuestia, the abode of that famous diviner, Mopsus. He, wandering from his fellow warriors the Argonauts when they were returning after carrying off the Golden Fleece, and being borne to the coast of Africa, met a sudden death. Thereafter his heroic remains, covered with Punic sod, have been for the most part effective in healing a variety of diseases. These two provinces, crowded with bands of brigands, were long ago, during the war with the pirates, sent under the yoke by the proconsul Servilius, and made to pay tribute. And these regions indeed, lying, as it were, upon a promontory, are separated from the eastern continent by Mount Amanus. But the frontier of the east, extending a long distance in a straight line, reaches from the banks of the Euphrates to the borders of the Nile, being bounded on the left by the Saracenic races, and on the right exposed to the waves of the sea. Of this district Nicator Seleucus took possession and greatly increased it in power. When by right of succession he was holding the rule of Persia after the death of Alexander of Macedon, and he was a successful and efficient king, as his surname Nicator indicates, for by taking advantage of the great number of men whom he ruled for a long time in peace, in place of their rustic dwellings he built cities of great strength and abundant wealth. And many of these, although they are called by their Greek names, which were imposed upon them by the will of their founder, nevertheless have not lost the old appellations in the Assyrian tongue which the original settlers gave them. And the first after Ostrione, which, as has been said, I have omitted from this account, Comagene, now called Euphratensis, gradually lifts itself into eminence. It is famous for the great cities of Hierapolis, the ancient Ninus, and Samosata. Next, Syria spreads for a distance over a beautiful plain. This is famed for Antioch, a city known to all the world and without a rival. So rich it is in imported and domestic commodities, likewise for Lachidokia, Apamea, and also Seleucia, cities that flourish from their very origin. After this comes Phoenicia, lying at the foot of Mount Labienus, a region full of charm and beauty, adorned with many great cities. Among these, in attractiveness and renown of their names, Tyre, Sidon, and Berytus are conspicuous, and equal to these are Emissa and Damascus, founded in the days long past. Now these provinces encircled by the river Orontes, which after flowing past the foot of that lofty mountain Cassius, empties into the Parthenian Sea, which were taken from the realms of the Armenians by Gnaeus Pompeius, after his defeat of Tigranes, and brought under Roman sway. The last region of the Syrians is Palestine, extending over a great extent of territory and abounding in cultivated and well-kept lands. It also has some splendid cities, none of which yields to any of the others, but they rival one another, as it were, by plumb line. These were Caesarea, which Herodes built in honor of the Emperor Octavianus, Eleutheropolis and Neapolis along the Ascalon and Gaza, built in a former age. In these districts, no navigable river is anywhere to be seen, but in numerous places natural warm springs gush forth, adapted to many medicinal uses. But these regions also met with a like fate, being formed into a province by Pompey, after he had defeated the Jews and taken Jerusalem, but left to the jurisdiction of a governor. Adjacent to this region is Arabia, which on the one side adjoins the country of Nabatea, a land producing a rich variety of wares and studded with strong castles and fortresses, which the watchful care of the early inhabitants reared in suitable and readily defended defiles, to check the inroads of the neighboring tribes. This region also has, in addition to some towns, great cities, Bostra, Gerasa, and Philadelphia, all strongly defended by mighty walls. It was given the name of a province, assigned a governor, and compelled to obey our laws by the Emperor Trajan, who, by frequent victories, crushed the arrogance of its inhabitants when he was waging glorious war with Medea and the Parthians. Cyprus, too, an island far removed from the mainland and abounding in harbors, besides having numerous towns, is made famous by two cities, Salamis and Paphos, the one celebrated for its shrines of Jupiter, the other for its temple of Venus. This Cyprus is so fertile and abounds in products of every kind that without the need of any help from without, by its native resources it builds cargo ships from the very keel to the topmast sails, and equipping them, completely entrusts them to the deep. Nor am I loth to say that the Roman people in invading that island showed more greed than justice. For King Ptolemy, our ally, joined to us by a treaty without any fault of his, merely because of the low state of our treasury, was ordered to be proscribed, and in consequence committed suicide by drinking poison, whereupon the island was made tributary, and its spoils, as though those of an enemy, were taken aboard our fleet, and brought to Rome by Cato. I shall now resume the thread of my narrative. Section 9 of Constantius Gallus Caesar. Amid this variety of disasters, Ursarcinus, to whose attendance the imperial command had attached me, was summoned from Nisibis, of which he was in charge, and was compelled, in spite of his reluctance and his opposition to the clamorous troops of flatterers, to investigate the accusations in the deadly strife. He was in fact a warrior, having always been a soldier and a leader of soldiers, but far removed from the wranglings of the forum, accordingly, worried by fear of the danger which threatened him, seeing the corrupt accusers and judges with whom he was associated all coming forth from the same holes, he informed Constantius by secret letters of what was going on furtively or openly, and begged for aid, that through fear of it the well-known arrogance of the Caesar might subside. But by too great caution he had fallen into worse snares, as we shall show later, since his rivals patched up dangerous plots with Constantius, who was in other respects a moderate emperor, but cruel and implacable, if anyone, however obscure, had whispered in his ear anything of that kind, and in cases of that nature, unlike himself. On the day set for the fatal examinations, the master of horse took his seat, ostensibly as a judge, attended by others who had been told in advance what was to be done, and here and there shorthand writers were stationed who reported every question and every answer post haste to Caesar. And by his cruel orders, instigated by the queen, who from time to time poked her face through a curtain, many were put to death without being allowed to clear themselves of the charges or to make any defense. First of all, then, Epigonus and Eusebius were brought before them and ruined by the affinity of their names. For Montius, as I have said, at the very end of his life had accused certain tribunes of forges, called by those names, of having promised support to some eminent enterprise, and Epigonus, for his part, was a philosopher only in his attire, as became evident, for when he had tried entreaties to no purpose, when his sides had been furrowed, and he was threatened with death, by a shameful confession, he declared that he was implicated in plans which never existed, whereas he had neither seen nor heard anything. He was wholly unacquainted with legal matters. Eusebius, on the contrary, courageously denied the charges, and although he was put upon the rack, he remained firm in the same degree of constancy, crying out that it was an act of brigands, and not a court of justice. And when, being acquainted with the law, he persistently called for his accuser in the usual formalities, Caesar, being informed of his demand and regarding his freedom of speech as arrogance, ordered that he be tortured as a reckless traducer. and when he had been so disemboweled that he had no parts left to torture, calling on heaven for justice and smiling sardonically, he remained unshaken, with stout heart, neither deigning to according himself nor anyone else, and at last, without having admitted his guilt or been convicted, he was condemned to death along with his abject associate. And he was led off to execution unafraid, railing at the wickedness of the time and imitating the ancient Stoic Zeno, who, after being tortured for a long time, to induce him to give false witness, tore his tongue from its roots and hurled it with its blood and spittle into the eyes of the king of Cyprus, who was putting him to the question. After this, the matter of the royal robe was investigated, and when those who were employed in dyeing purple were tortured and had confessed to making a short tunic to cover the chest, a man named Maurus was brought in, a deacon, as the Christians called them. A letter of his was presented, written in Greek, to the foreman of a weaving plant in Tyre, strongly urging him to speed up a piece of work, but what it was the letter did not say. But although finally Maurus also was tortured within an inch of his life, he could not be forced to make any confession. So when many men of various conditions had been put to the question, some things were found to be doubtful, and others were obviously unimportant. And after many had been put to death, the two Apollinares, father and son, were exiled. But when they came to a place called Craterei, namely a villa of theirs distant 24 miles from Antioch, their legs were broken, according to orders, and they were killed. After their death, Gallus, no whit less ferocious than before, like a lion that had tasted blood, tried many cases of the kind. But all of these it is not worth while to give any account, for fear that I may exceed the limits which I have set myself, a thing which I certainly ought to avoid. Section 10. The Alamanni sue for peace, which is granted by Constantius Augustus. While the East was enduring this long tyranny, as soon as the warm season began, Constantius, being in his 7th consulship with Gallus, in his 2nd, set out from Arelate for Valentia, to make war upon the brothers Gundomadus and Valomarius, kings of the Alamanni, whose frequent raids were devastating that part of Gaul which adjoined their frontiers. And while he delayed there for a long time, waiting for supplies, the transport of which from Aquitania was hindered by spring rains of unusual frequency and by rivers in flood. Herculanus came there, one of his bodyguard, the son of Hermogenes, formerly commander of the cavalry and, as we have seen before related, torn to pieces in a riot of the people at Constantinople. When this man gave a true account of what Gallus and his wife had done, the emperor, grieving over the past disasters and made anxious by fear of those to come, concealed the distress that he felt as long as he could. The soldiers, however, who in the meantime had been assembled at Chalons, began to rage with impatience at the delay, being even more incensed because they lacked even the necessities of life, since the usual supplies had not yet been brought. Therefore Rufinus, who was at that time praetorian prefect, was exposed to extreme danger, for he was forced to go in person before the troops, who were aroused by both the scarcity and by their natural savage temper, and besides were naturally inclined to be harsh and bitter towards men in civil positions, in order to pacify them and explain why the convoy of provisions was interrupted. This was a shrewd plan, cunningly devised with a set purpose, in order that by a plot of this kind the uncle of Gallus might perish, for fear that so very powerful of a man might whet the boldness of his nephew and encourage his dangerous designs. But great precautions were taken, and when the design was postponed, Eusebius, the Grand Chamberlain, was sent to Chalons taking gold with him. When this had been secretly distributed among the turbulent inciters of rebellion, the rage of the soldiers abated, and the safety of the prefect was assured. Then an abundant supply of food arrived, and the camp was moved on the appointed day. And so after surmounting many difficulties, overpassed many of which were heaped high with snow, they came near to Rauracum, on the banks of the river Rhine. There a great force of the Alamanni opposed them, and hurling weapons from all sides like hail, by their superior numbers prevented the Romans from making a bridge by joining the boats together. And when that was obviously impossible, the emperor was consumed with anxious thought, and in doubt of what course to take. But lo, a guide acquainted with the region unexpectedly appeared, and, in return for money, pointed out by night a place abounding in shallows, where the river could be crossed. And there the army might be led over, while the enemy's attention was turned elsewhere, had not a few men of that same race, who held military positions of high rank, informed their countrymen of the design by secret messengers, as some thought. Now the shame of that suspicion fell upon Latinus, count in command of the bodyguard, Agilo, tribune in the charge of the stable, and Scudillo, commander of the targeteers, who were then highly regarded as having in their hands the defense of the state. But the savages, taking such counsel as the immediate circumstances demanded, since the obstinacy which inspired such a bold resistance was diminished perhaps because the auspices were unfavorable, or because the authority of their sacrifices forbade an engagement, sent their chiefs to sue for peace and pardon for their offenses. Therefore, the envoys of both kings were detained, and the matter was discussed for a long time in secret. And since there was a general agreement in the opinion that peace, which was asked for on reasonable conditions, ought to be granted, and that it would be expedient to do so under the present circumstances, the emperor summoned an assembly of the army. Intending to say a few words appropriate to the occasion, and taking his place upon a tribunal, surrounded by a staff of high officials, he spoke after this fashion, quote, "Let no one, I pray, be surprised, if after going through the toil of long marches and getting together great quantities of supplies, I now, when approaching the abode of those savages, with my confidence in you leading the way, as if by a sudden change of plan, have turned to milder designs. For each one of you, according to his rank and judgment, upon consideration will find it to be true, that the soldier in all instances, however strong and vigorous of body, regards and defends only himself and his own life. The commander, on the other hand, has manifold duties, since he aims at fairness to all. And being the guardian of others' safety, he realizes that the interest of the people look to him wholly for protection, and that therefore he ought eagerly to seize upon all remedies which the condition of affairs allows, as though offered to him by the favor of heaven. To put the matter, then, in a few words, and to explain why I have wished you all to be present here together, my loyal fellow soldiers, receive with favorable ears what I shall briefly set forth. For perfect truth is always simple. The kings and peoples of the Alamanni, in dread of the rising progress of your glory, which fame, growing greatly, has spread abroad even among the dwellers in far-off lands, through the envoys whom you see with bowed heads ask for peace and indulgence for past offenses. This I, being cautious, prudent, and an adviser of what is expedient, think ought to be granted to them, if I have your consent, for many reasons. First, to avoid the doubtful issues of war. Then, that we may gain friends in place of enemies, as they promise. Again, that without bloodshed we may tame their haughty fierceness, which is often destructive to the provinces. Finally, bearing in mind this thought, that not only is the enemy vanquished who falls in battle, borne down by weight of arms and strength, but much more safely he who, while the trumpet is silent, of his own accord passes under the yoke, and learns by experience that Romans lack neither courage against rebels nor mildness towards suppliants. In short, I await your decision as arbiters, as it were, being myself convinced as a peace-loving prince, that it is best temperately to show moderation while prosperity is with us. For believe me, such righteous conduct will be attributed, not to a lack of spirit, but to discretion and humanity." End quote of Constantius Augustus. No sooner had he finished speaking than the whole throng, fully in agreement with the emperor's wish, praised his purpose and unanimously voted for peace. They were influenced especially by the conviction, which they had formed from frequent campaigns, that his fortune watched over him only in civil troubles, but that when foreign wars were undertaken, they had often ended disastrously. After this, a treaty was struck in accordance with the rights of the Alamanni, and when the ceremony had been concluded, the emperor withdrew to Mediolanum for his winter quarters.
Thank you very much.